For a few short years in the middle of the last century, the single most crowded place in the entire history of the human race was not a city you have ever heard of. It was not Tokyo, or Hong Kong, or New York. It was a bare lump of rock in the sea, smaller than a single city block, with more than 5,000 people stacked on top of it. And then, almost overnight, every last one of them left. Today, not one human being lives there. The doors are still hanging open. The televisions are still sitting in the empty rooms where families left them, and the whole gray city is being slowly, quietly pulled back into the sea it was built on. In January of 1974, the people who owned this island announced that it was over, and the city did not fade away slowly, the way places usually die. It emptied like someone had pulled a plug. Families packed what they could carry onto boats. The school emptied, the shops closed. Within a matter of months, a community of thousands was simply gone, and by that April the last person had stepped onto the last boat and left the rock to the wind. They left the tables set. They left toys on the floor. They left photographs on the walls. And they left behind a secret, buried underneath their sunny little city, that a lot of them had spent their whole lives trying not to look at, because the rock they lived on was hollow, and the way it was hollowed out is a much darker story than the bright, crowded town on the surface ever let on. This is Hashima, and it is the story of the most crowded place that ever existed, and how quickly the most crowded place on Earth can become the emptiest. It sits about 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki, in southern Japan, and for most of history it was nothing at all. Just a bare reef the sea broke over. Then, in 1810, someone found coal in it, and in 1890, the Mitsubishi company bought the entire island because they had worked out that beneath it, running out under the seabed, were some of the richest coal seams in Japan. To get the coal, they needed miners. To keep miners on a bare rock in a typhoon-battered sea, they needed to build them a city. So Mitsubishi began to pour concrete. They built seawalls and reclaimed land until the island was 3 times its natural size, a rectangle of stone 480 meters long. In 1916, they put up the first large concrete apartment block in the history of Japan, 9 stories tall, with no elevator, built deliberately heavy and squat to shrug off the typhoons. And then they built another, and another, packed so tightly together and stacked so high that from a distance, out on the water, the island stopped looking like an island at all. It looked like a warship. During the war, an American submarine is said to have fired a torpedo at it, because from the sea it looked exactly like a battleship sitting at anchor. And the name stuck. The people called it Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. And the city they built inside that battleship was extraordinary. By 1959, there were 5,259 people living on 16 acres of rock. I want you to try to picture that density, because it is almost impossible. It was roughly 9 times as crowded as Tokyo was at the time, and Tokyo was the most crowded city on the planet. It remains, to this day, the highest population density any human settlement has ever reached, anywhere, ever. And it was not a slum. It was a genuinely good place to live. There were 2 schools, a hospital, a cinema, shops, bars, a pachinko parlor, a shrine, even a swimming pool, all stacked into this vertical maze of concrete and connected by walkways strung between the rooftops. The buildings were so close together that neighbors could pass things to each other window to window, and children could cross almost the entire island without ever touching the ground, running along the covered walkways from block to block, up and down the stairwells, through a concrete world that was theirs. The wages from the mine were double or triple what you could earn on the mainland. The rent was almost nothing. By the 1960s, the families on this remote sea rock owned more television sets, per household, than almost anywhere else in Japan. From the air, the rooftops were a forest of TV aerials. And here is the detail about this place that I love the most. Hashima had a nickname before it was ever called Battleship Island. Because it was solid concrete, with not one scrap of soil on it, the people who lived there called it the island without greenery. They hated that. So they did something about it. They loaded sacks of earth onto the boats from the mainland, and they carried that soil up 9 flights of stairs, by hand, onto the roofs of their apartment blocks, and they built gardens up there. Vegetable plots and flower beds, hanging in the sky above the sea. They grew tomatoes and morning glory on the roof of the most crowded place on Earth, and they gave the island a second, kinder nickname. They called it Midori no Shima, The Green Island. That is the city on the surface. Now we have to go underneath it. Because everything on that island, the wages, the televisions, the rooftop gardens, all of it rested on the mine. And the mine was a nightmare. The shafts went down as far as a kilometer and then ran out horizontally beneath the seafloor. Down at the coal face, the temperature passed 40 degrees, the humidity sat at 95%, and gas leaked constantly out of the rock. Seawater seeped in. And some of the seams were so shallow that men had to work lying flat on their sides, hacking at the coal with the ceiling 50 centimeters above their faces. Even in its early years, it had another name too, one the tourist brochures do not use. They called it Prison Island. And during the Second World War, that was closer to the truth than anyone wants to admit. Because a large part of the labor that dug this coal, in those years, came from people who were never given a choice. Between about 1943 and 1945, under Japan's colonial rule of Korea, an estimated 500 to 800 Korean laborers were forcibly brought to Hashima and put to work in that undersea mine, alongside Chinese laborers, in the worst and most dangerous sections of it. We know, from the island's own cremation records, that around 122 of those Korean workers died here in those few years. From the accidents, from the conditions, from being 19 years old at the bottom of the sea in a place called Prison Island. One of them was a boy named Su Jung-woo, who was sent here at just 14 years old. He survived. And decades later, in 1983, he was one of the first to stand up and describe what the bottom of that mine had actually been like, and how many of the young men he arrived with never made it back home. For a long time, that side of Hashima's story was simply left out. If a place like this, and the people the world nearly forgot, are the kind of history you think deserves to be remembered, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Because there is one more twist in the story of this island, and it is the one nobody on Hashima saw coming. After everything, after 80 years of digging, after the deaths and the danger and the crowded, thriving city on top, Hashima was not brought down by a disaster. It was not a typhoon, or a flood, or an explosion that ended it. It was economics. Through the 1960s, Japan began to switch from coal to oil, and the deepest, hottest, most expensive coal mine in the country, out under the sea, simply stopped being worth the money. There was still coal down there was just no longer any reason to pay to bring it up. And so, in January of 1974, Mitsubishi announced that the mine was closing. And with the mine went the only reason anyone had ever lived on that rock. What happened next was the fastest death of a city you can imagine. There was no slow decline, no dwindling away over decades. The moment the mine shut, the countdown began, and everyone left at once. By April, the Green Island was empty. 5,000 people had become zero. And they left it exactly as it stood. Nobody knocked it down, nobody carried the furniture away, they just closed the doors, or in many cases did not even bother to, and got on the boats. And so for 50 years, Hashima has sat out there in the sea as a perfect, frozen snapshot of the day everybody left. There are still black and white televisions in the empty apartments, stopped clocks on the walls, cups on the tables, shoes by the doors, a child's toys on a dusty floor. The wind pours through the broken windows and down the concrete canyons where 5,000 people used to live, and there is no one there to hear it. A year after the last family left, in 1975, they built a lighthouse on the island. It was automatic, and it was the first lighthouse Hashima had ever needed, because for 80 years the island itself had been lit up like a lantern every night, 5,000 windows glowing over the sea. Now that the windows were dark, for the first time, the ships needed a light to warn them of the rock. And the last thing is the thing that gets me. Up on those rooftops, where the families once hauled soil by hand to grow their tomatoes and their flowers, plants are growing again. Wild ones now. Ferns and grasses and little trees have taken root in the ruins of the rooftop gardens, spreading across the gray concrete, pulling the whole battleship slowly back toward the sea. The island without greenery is turning green all over again, just not for anyone. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest stories. This one rock, smaller than a city block, was once the most crowded patch of ground in the entire history of our species. It was a good home and a brutal prison at the very same time, and it never fully admitted to being both. And then the world changed its mind about coal, and in a single season the most crowded place on Earth became one of the emptiest, and it has been sitting out there in the sea off Nagasaki ever since. Doors open, clocks stopped, quietly going green, waiting for people who are never coming back. If you've ever heard of Hashima or Gunkanjima, or you've seen that battleships shape out on the water, let me know in the comments, and let me know where I should go next. See you in the next one.